Hello guys and welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about something that happens in Prague, which is in the country of Czechoslovakia at the time, and we're going to be exploring what happens. So Czechoslovakia is another country which lay within the Soviet sphere of influence that challenged the Soviet dominance, okay, just like Hungary did. By the 1950s, the difference in living conditions, living standards between the communist East and the capitalist West was getting harder to hide. People behind the Iron Curtain had become increasingly frustrated by the lack of freedom and low standard of living that they had. Today's lesson will look at Czechoslovakia and what happened when in 1968, a new leader, a man called Dubcek, attempted to give his citizens extra rights that moved away from a strict Soviet system. Now this lesson, this event is called the Prague Spring, okay? So it's called the Prague Spring and it happens in 1968 in Czechoslovakia. So in order to understand what happens in 1968, we'll need to understand the history and context of Czechoslovakia, especially their relationship with communism and the Soviet Union. So it's an example much like Hungary and the Hungarian uprising we looked at in 1956, if you remember. We looked at the Hungarian uprising. We had to understand the background and history before we could understand the present. And the same with Czechoslovakia. So first thing I'm going to do now is go through what happens at the end of World War II to the country of Czechoslovakia. So after World War II, at the end of World War II, the Red Army captured Prague, which is in Czechoslovakia, in 1945 from the Germans. By 1948, Czechoslovakia was the sole remaining, and on my map you can see it's there, it's the sole remaining non-communist state in Eastern Europe. So look at the map, look at where Czechoslovakia is. Imagine just that country is not pink anymore, and it's surrounded by all those other countries which are part of this Eastern Bloc, which are communist, okay? So it's the sole remaining country that wasn't. Now, elections were coming up in May, and the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia was expected to do badly. Okay, so it was expected that it would remain non-communist. So a coalition government is set up by this man who is a non-communist, President Benz. However, the communist leader, this man over here, Gottwald, so the communist leader here, Gottwald, he controls the radio, the army, and the police. So you can see clearly that we've had some interference here from the USSR and some coercion, remember that word means force, to try to get Czechoslovakia to turn communist despite the new elections and the result. So Gottwald became prime minister and he sets up a secret police force to begin arresting non-communists. It's very similar to the salami tactics used in Hungary to gain control of the country. So both cases are actually very, very similar. In 1948, communist workers go on strike, and an outspoken non-communist minister actually commits suicide, but in very suspicious circumstances. He throws himself out the window, but everybody believes it's not suicide, it's actually a murder of him. So as we can imagine, Gottwald then takes over government and President Benz is forced to resign, and Czechoslovakia has now essentially fallen to communism. It's an example where we can see the use of force and coercion, and remember this is also happening at the same time as the American Congress is discussing whether to go ahead with the Marshall Plan. So when we discuss the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine, Congress is a bit unsure about going ahead. They don't know if they want to kind of end that isolationism, and Czechoslovakia falls to communism, and it's that pushes them and triggers them to put the plan into action. Another country has fallen to communism through Stalin's force, okay? And that's what pushes the Marshall Plan to be put through Congress and to go ahead. So, as with other countries that have fallen to communism and are behind the Iron Curtain, Czechoslovakian society was tightly controlled. It had a one-party communist state that answered directly to Moscow, and it was a member of the Warsaw Pact. The government controlled the press, and censorship became law in 1948. So remember, censorship is where you control the media and the press, and dozens of magazines and journals are shut down. Opposition is not tolerated, and from 1949 to 1954, Stalin calls for purges of military leaders, Catholics, Jews, and democratic politicians. Almost 180 people are executed, and the trials are far from being fair. For example, defendants were often branded guilty before the trial even began, and they were sometimes even forced to rehearse their testimonies beforehand as if it was kind of like a cruel play. It's all an act. So 180 people are executed, and Stalin orders these purges to go ahead. Now, somebody who went through this experience is this lady here, and her name is Milada Horokova. She was the only woman to be executed, and her death sentence was condemned by figures all over the world. For example, Albert Einstein, Winston Churchill, and Eleanor Roosevelt. But rather than falling to this international pressure, the Soviets brought her execution date further forward. She was accused of high treason and she was executed. So she's a notable example of somebody who kind of fell to the purges in Czechoslovakia. So not only do we have the censorship and the purges, but we also have forced collectivization, like what happened in East Germany. So remember, that's when they forced farms to be taken away and then given into state control and broken up into smaller parts for individual people to farm. So no one was allowed to own more than 50 hectares of land themselves. In addition, people set up underground movement of clergy as the communists took over the church property and closed down all of the 216 monasteries and most of the 339 convents. Some clergymen were even murdered, and others were sent to labor and prison camps. Students had to study Marxism and Leninism at school and learned by rote. That means you learn off by heart. So imagine if when we go back to school, I give you a piece of paper and the whole lesson, I don't teach you anything. It's not teaching, it's you now learn this off by heart. And what you're learning is all about Marx and Lenin and propaganda saying how amazing they are and how fantastic the Soviet Union is. They weren't encouraged to have their own opinions, and they were only accepted into university if they had working class backgrounds, supported communism, and had participated in communist youth organizations. In the 1960s, Czechoslovakia also underwent an economic downturn, so their economy starts to fail. The Soviet model of industrialization did not apply very well to Czechoslovakia, as the country had already been industrialized before World War II, so earlier on. The Soviet model had been designed specifically for countries with less developed economies, and this began to spur demands for political reform. Now, not only was the economy falling apart and people were demanding changes to the system because of that, because of the lack of money in the country, but we also have this man, Antonin Novotny, who was the leader of Czechoslovakia in the 1960s, and he was known to be very, very, very corrupt. So mounting economic problems, communist leaders in Moscow became concerned that he was discrediting the regime and that actually the image of the party was becoming disliked and corrupt. So even in the USSR themselves, they're starting to think we might need to get rid of him and replace him with somebody else because he was so unpopular at the time. Okay, now I know there's lots of different people I'm going through, so hopefully we're keeping on track of this. But by the mid-1960s, a respected Czech economist by the name of Otto Sik, so it's this guy here, called for economic reform, and he recommended the following things. So he recommended less central control of the economy and lifting of the ban on private businesses, rights for more consumers, more power for ordinary workers, and the government should be ready to listen to people's concerns. Now, the USSR rejected the suggestion, and in 1966, Sik, the same man, called for full political reform. So from that very beginning point of the economy starting to downturn, we had people calling for reform. Otto Sik then comes out and says these things will help the economy, we should now do them. The USSR reject them. And then Otto Sik says, okay, well, we need full political reform then. If you're not going to listen to us, we need to change the whole system. He believed it was the only way to improve the economy, and his ideas began to grow in popularity. Moscow realized they needed to change something quite drastically and significantly in order to prevent a revolt. So what do they do? Well, this is what they do. In January of 1968, Novotny was forced to resign by the Soviet government, and he's replaced by this man, Alexander Dubcek, another senior Communist Party official. Now, the Soviets and their new leader, Brezhnev, remember I told you Khrushchev is removed after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's removed in 1964, so a couple of years afterwards, but the legacy of that helps to remove him, and he's replaced by a new leader, Brezhnev. But Brezhnev believes that Dubcek will manage the situation and calm down these calls for change in Czechoslovakia. However, it all goes wrong for the Soviet Union because immediately Dubcek sets about introducing political reforms, taking the Soviets by surprise. For example, he almost immediately allows a scholar named Goldstucker to openly criticize Novotny, exposing communist policies and how they were preventing progress in Czechoslovakia. Now, to say that is a direct attack on the Soviet Union, and we would normally have expected that person to be kind of imprisoned, maybe even executed, but he suffered no repercussions, and it only persuaded him to go on, Goldstucker, to produce the first censor-free journal in Czechoslovakia. This went on to have 300,000 copies circulating, making it the most published periodical in the whole of Europe. This shows Dubček's intent to have a new type of socialism in Czechoslovakia, so to retain some of those core principles of communism, but he calls it socialism with a human face, as I've written there for you. That's kind of the slogan of his way of thinking about this. So we can have communism, we can have socialism, but we can have it without all of the brutality, essentially, that the USSR is kind of showing at this time. So what does he actually do? Well, he wants to remove state controls on industry and allow Czechs to run their own businesses. He wants to allow public meetings and freedom of speech. He wants to end press censorship, and he wants to give Czechs the right to visit non-communist countries. Because at the moment, you're not allowed to visit non-communist countries or even travel abroad in most communist countries in the Eastern Bloc. In a speech, Dubcek commented that the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia's mission was to build a socialism that corresponds to the historic democratic traditions in Czechoslovakia, a clear demand to loosen those ties of Soviet communism. You know, he even says the word democracy in there. The Communist Party would stay in power, but other organizations such as trade unions would be allowed to form, and Dubcek pledged total loyalty to the Warsaw Pact and promised communism would remain. But Moscow, however, still becomes increasingly worried and uneasy about these reforms. Remember, with Hungary, it was only with the moment of breaking with the Warsaw Pact that Hungary became such a problem. So Dubcek is hoping that by kind of assuring the USSR that no, we're going to stay in the Warsaw Pact, that he's kind of helping Czechoslovakia to be able to get away with this. So in April of 1968, Dubcek launches the Action Programme in Czechoslovakia, which gave increasing freedoms of the press, speech, and movement. It also gave the possibility of a multi-party government. It limited the power of the secret police. It covered foreign policy and spoke of the maintenance of good relations with Western countries and cooperation with the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc. It spoke of a 10-year transition period within which democratic elections would be made possible and a new form of democratic socialism would replace the status quo. It also laid the foundations of this Prague Spring movement, Dubček's ever more radical change. This led to anti-Soviet polemics appearing in the press on the 26th of June 1968, so anti-Soviet publications, and the Social Democrats began to form a separate party. Now, all of this worried the USSR, as you can imagine, but this is what we call the Prague Spring, okay? The introduction of these new reforms by Dubcek.